A nursing home, that was the future my daughter chose for me. Not with a conversation, not even to my face, but through a phone she forgot to hang up. I didn't argue. I let the words sink in while the walls around me felt colder than ever. Soon, the house I had built was sold for $1 million. But when they came back, their key was useless in the lock, and waiting on the doorstep was a single note. They read it, and then their screams carried farther than their laughter ever had. Before we dive in, please consider giving us a thumbs up. The soil was cool and dark against my fingertips, a familiar comfort. I was in the garden, the one my wife Mary had started, tending to her roses. Their scent hung heavy in the late afternoon air, a sweet perfume that was the closest thing I had to her presence now. Each bloom was a memory. It was in this quiet sanctuary that I found my peace, a fragile thing since she'd been gone. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway shattered the calm. I didn't need to look up. The low purr of expensive German engineering belonged to my son-in-law, Kyler. He and my daughter, Brielle, had developed a habit of these surprise visits, their concern always feeling a little too polished. I rose slowly, brushing the dirt from my knees. Brielle wore a smile as bright and artificial as the gemstones on her wrist. Kyler followed a step behind, his own smile a thin, practiced line. "Dad, you shouldn't be overdoing it," Brielle said, her voice a carefully modulated coo, kissing the air beside my cheek. "We were just in the neighborhood." They were always just in the neighborhood. I offered them iced tea, and we settled onto the patio. They asked the usual questions, and I gave the usual answers, all the while watching their eyes scan the property. They weren't looking at a home. They were appraising an asset. After a few minutes, Brielle's phone buzzed. "Oh, it's the office. I have to take this." She stepped inside, sliding the glass door almost shut, leaving a small gap. I watched Kyler, who was scrolling through his phone, oblivious. I could hear the murmur of Brielle's voice, then the tone shifted. The call must have ended, because I heard her speak to someone else, her voice sharp and clear, thinking she had hung up. I sat perfectly still, the glass of iced tea cold in my hand, the condensation dripping onto my fingers. A strange calm washed over me, a chilling clarity. The grief I had carried for Mary was suddenly replaced by something cold and hard as steel. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a profound disappointment, the kind that severs ties as cleanly as a sharpened blade. I heard the click of her phone as she finally, truly ended the call. The sliding door opened, and she stepped back onto the patio, her face a perfect mask of daughterly affection. "Sorry about that, Dad. You know how work is." I simply nodded, the taste of the tea now bitter in my mouth. She sat down, leaning forward. "Dad, Kyler and I have been talking, and we're worried about you here all alone." Her voice was soft, laced with a fabricated concern that made my skin crawl. "This house is so big. We found this wonderful place, more of a community, really. We could sell this house, and you wouldn't have to worry about a thing ever again." She laid it all out, the plan I had just heard her rehearse. Kyler chimed in, nodding seriously, speaking of investments and financial security. They were a team, a pair of smiling vultures. I let them finish, listening to every hollow promise. They were waiting for an argument, for a fight they were prepared to win with patience and pity. I gave them none of it. When they were done, I looked out at Mary's roses, their petals catching the golden light. Then I turned back to them and said, "Okay." The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Brielle's painted lips parted in surprise. "Okay?" she repeated, her voice a little too high. "Just okay?" I nodded. "It sounds like you've thought it through. If you think it's for the best, then that's what we'll do." Their shock quickly melted into a poorly concealed glee. They thought I was a fool. They spent another hour discussing logistics before finally leaving. I watched their car disappear, the red taillights shrinking into the twilight. The house was silent again. but it was the quiet of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. I went to my study, walking past a lifetime of memories they were so eager to sell. I stopped at an old filing cabinet and pulled open the bottom drawer. My fingers found a thick, leather-bound binder. The gold lettering on the spine was faded but clear. Martinson Trust and Estate. I placed it squarely in the center of my desk. Then I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. He answered on the second ring. "Maverick," I said, my voice steady and cold. They made their move. As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of a framed photo of Mary. The man looking back at me was a stranger, his eyes hard, and his face set like stone. Maverick arrived just after sunrise, letting himself in through the back gate like he'd done for 40 years. He was a man carved from tough timber, with hands that were a roadmap of hard work. He poured himself a mug of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The Martinson Trust binder lay between us. He didn't need to read it. He'd been there when my lawyer drafted it years ago. He was the executor, the one man I trusted. "So," he said, his voice a low rumble, "the little vultures are finally swooping in." I nodded. "They think I'm just going to roll over." Maverick took a long sip, his eyes fixed on me. He wasn't a man for empty sympathies. He was a problem solver. "What's the play?" he asked. I looked past him, through the kitchen window. "Remember when we built this place?" I asked, a genuine smile touching my lips. "Mary found the design in a magazine. A kit home, all the way from California." Maverick chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "I remember. 3 flatbed trucks rolling up that driveway. Your neighbors thought you were crazy." He had been my partner on the project, the one who knew the house almost as well as I did. "Mary loved it," I said softly. She stood on that slab of concrete and watched them crane the first wall into place. She said it was like our life, all the best pieces shipped in and fitted together perfectly. The memory was a shield, a warm cover for the cold, hard fact it concealed. The house wasn't just built, it was assembled. Maverick's eyes met mine. He knew the house's secret. He'd been the one to bolt the pieces together. We spent the next hour talking about logistics, timelines, phone calls, the precise steps of taking back what was mine. By the time the sun was high, we were ready. Right on cue, Kyler's silver sedan returned. This time they brought the lawyer, a young man in a suit a size too tight, his face a mixture of ambition and inexperience. Brielle introduced him with a flourish. We sat in my study, the air thick with the ghosts of their betrayal. The young lawyer set his briefcase on my desk with a loud snap and pulled out the power of attorney. His eyes flickered to the thick binder labeled Martinson Trust and Estate. He gave it a dismissive glance, a slight curl to his lip, as if it were a dusty relic. "This is a standard power of attorney," he explained, his voice slick. "It simply gives them the authority to manage the sale on your behalf. It'll save you the headache." I looked at Brielle, who was watching me with predatory intensity. Kyler stood behind her, trying to look casual. Maverick was there, a silent, solid weight in the room. Just an old friend, as far as they were concerned. I picked up the pen. I could feel their impatience radiating across the room. They wanted my signature. They wanted the key to their future. I let them wait before I finally scratched my name on the line. The relief was overwhelming. Brielle's smile was blinding. Kyler clapped the young lawyer on the back. They had their prize. "We'll be in touch, Dad," Brielle said, planting an airy kiss near my cheek. "You just relax." As they walked out, I heard Kyler mutter, "That was easier than I thought." They didn't see the look that passed between me and Maverick. They saw what they wanted to see. A weak, compliant old man. The sound of their car faded. Maverick walked over from the window. He looked down at the spot where the power of attorney had been, then at the thick, unassuming binder that had been ignored. He shook his head slowly, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Fools," he said, his voice low and sharp as a shard of glass. They just brought a plastic knife to a gunfight. The days that followed were a strange limbo. The house felt like a holding cell. Brielle and Kyler were a whirlwind of distant activity, treating the sale of my home like a corporate merger. The phone would ring. Brielle's voice on the other end, always bright, always brief. "Just wanted to let you know the inspection went perfectly, Dad." Or, "Great news. We have a fantastic offer." Each call was a condescending pat on the head. I played my part, offering a quiet, "That's wonderful, dear." My compliance fueled their confidence. They mistook my silence for weakness. Inside, however, a cold engine was turning. I was a general on a quiet hill, watching the enemy advance into a valley of their own choosing. The final call came on a Tuesday. "It's done, Dad!" Brielle's voice was a high, triumphant squeal. "The papers are signed, everything's in escrow. $1 million. Can you even believe it?" I could. "To celebrate," she continued, "we're taking you out tonight. The best steakhouse in the city." It wasn't a treat for me. It was a victory lap for them. And they wanted me there as a living trophy. "That sounds lovely," I said. The restaurant was a cavern of dark wood and the low hum of money. We were led to a booth in the center of the room. Brielle had invited an audience. Jackson, her colleague, was there with his quiet wife. He was a corporate yes man who saw Brielle and Kyler as a rung on his ladder. He pumped my hand with manufactured enthusiasm. "It's so wonderful what they're doing for you," he said, his voice loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. Brielle and Kyler basked in the praise. They ordered the most expensive wine, and Kyler launched into a heroic narrative of their selfless decision to put my well-being above all else. They were magnificent actors. I sat through it all, a silent, smiling prop. Then I saw my opening. "It all sounds wonderful," I said. "I was just wondering, what's the name of the facility?" The question was simple, but to Brielle, it was a deviation from the script. A flash of panic crossed her eyes before she smothered it with a laugh. "Oh, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Let's not get bogged down in the boring details tonight. This is a celebration." She then turned to Jackson and his wife. "He gets so fixated on the little things," she said, her voice a stage whisper. "It's sweet, but it's part of the reason we knew we had to step in. His mind, it wanders." There it was. The public humiliation. She had used my question as proof of my incompetence. Jackson nodded with pitying understanding. His wife, however, gave a tight, uncomfortable smile and looked down at her plate, a small crack in their polished performance. In that moment, I was no longer a man. I was a burden. Kyler raised his glass. "And soon, we'll be taking a much-needed vacation," he announced. "A few weeks in Europe, a little reward for all the stress of getting this deal done." He looked directly at me. "To new beginnings." The glasses clinked. I raised my own, my expression unreadable. Later, back at the house, the performance was over. Kyler tossed my house keys onto the granite countertop. The metallic clatter was unnaturally loud. "Won't be needing these for much longer," he said with a smirk. I stared at the keys, 40 years of my life, discarded like loose change. Brielle handed me an envelope of cash. "Here's $500, she said, her tone the one a person uses with a child. Their flight left in 2 days. "Just pack the essentials, Dad," she instructed. "The things that really matter." I walked them to the door. Brielle gave me a hug devoid of all warmth. "Be good, Dad," she whispered. "When we get back, we'll take you to your new home." I watched their taillights disappear, then closed the door and locked the deadbolt. The sound was a declaration of war. My phone chimed with a calendar notification. Phase 2. Departure confirmed. I walked back to the dining table they had just left. A single drop of red wine stained the white tablecloth, dark and perfect, like a drop of blood. The morning after they left for Paris was unnervingly quiet. It was the silence of absence, not of peace. I woke before dawn and made coffee. The $500 Brielle had left sat on the counter. I placed it in an envelope addressed to a children's charity. It was the last thing of theirs I would ever touch. My phone rang at precisely 7 a.m. It was my bank manager. The wire transfer was completed, she said. $1 million. The bait was taken. They were 30,000 feet over the Atlantic, sipping champagne, unaware that the foundation of their victory was crumbling. They thought they were selling a property, but they had only sold the dirt beneath it. The trust Mary and I had established legally separated the physical house from the land, a detail so unusual their cheap lawyer never thought to look for it. Maverick arrived shortly after, blueprints under his arm. "Apex is on standby," he said. "The crew is ready. The developer is ready." Maverick had quietly handled the real sale, selling the now vacant land to a commercial developer for significantly more than my children had settled for. "They're in the air," I said. "The money is theirs, for now." Maverick nodded, a grim smile on his face. "Then let's make the call." The first truck arrived an hour later, a massive 18-wheel flatbed. Soon, my quiet street looked like a military staging area. Men in hard hats unloaded enormous steel beams and hydraulic jacks. My neighbors began to emerge. One of them, a man I'd known for years, wandered over. "Everything all right over there?" he called out. "Foundation work," I said smoothly. "Found some cracks. Decided it was time to get it properly secured." He nodded, accepting the plausible lie. The work began immediately, the whine of concrete saws echoing through the neighborhood. I felt each cut like a surgeon's scalpel. They excavated around the perimeter, exposing the concrete slab Mary and I had stood on, dreaming. By the end of the day, the house was surrounded by a trench. They began sliding massive steel shielded beams beneath it. I stayed in the house that evening, the air thick with the smell of dust and diesel. I could feel the empty space beneath the floorboards, an unsettling void. Sleep did not come easily. I lay in bed, listening to the groans of a house under stress. The second day was the day of the lift. The hydraulic jacks began to push. I stood in the yard with Maverick, watching. The entire house began to rise. A visible gap appeared between the house and its foundation, widening until the building was suspended 6 feet in the air. It was a surreal, breathtaking sight. The house was no longer a home. It was cargo. That night, I walked through the suspended house one last time. The feeling was profoundly strange. The views from the windows were wrong, disconnected. I walked through each room, a ghost in my own life. They hadn't just sold a house, they had tried to erase a history. And in doing so, they had erased themselves from my future. I stayed in Maverick's guest room that night. Before I left, I looked at my home, floating in the darkness, lonely and vulnerable. The next morning, a self-propelled modular transporter arrived, a massive multi-wheeled platform. The crew spent hours securing the house to it. By noon, everything was ready. All that was left was the signal. I sat in Maverick's truck a block away, waiting. Every minute felt like an hour. Then, my phone chimed. It was a text from an international number, a picture of Brielle and Kyler smiling in front of the Eiffel Tower. "Arrived safely. Paris is amazing. Hope the packing is going well. Love you." I stared at their triumphant faces, so completely unaware. I forwarded the message to Maverick. He glanced at it, then looked at me. I gave a single, sharp nod. He picked up his radio. "All right, boys," he said, his voice calm and clear. "She's on the move. Let's take her home." The morning of the move arrived gray and cool, with clouds hanging low like witnesses gathering for something momentous. I had been awake since 3 a.m, sitting in Maverick's truck parked across the street from my house, watching the crew make their final preparations in the pre-dawn darkness. Their work lights cast long shadows that danced across the empty lot where my neighbors' houses stood, making everything look like a stage set for some impossible performance. The lead engineer, a woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, walked the perimeter of the house one final time, her flashlight beam playing across the support beams that had been installed over the past week. She spoke into a handheld radio in technical terms I didn't fully understand, but her tone was confident, methodical. This was not her first impossible job, though she had admitted to Maverick that it was certainly one of the more unusual ones. With a low hydraulic hiss that sounded like the earth itself exhaling, the platform took the full weight of the house. The sound was deeper than I had expected, resonating through the ground and up through the truck's frame, making my bones vibrate with its frequency. There was a moment of absolute stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath, deciding whether to cooperate with this insane plan. Then came a deep, resonant groan, the sound of 40 years of stillness being broken, of roots being pulled from soil, of a life being uprooted in the most literal sense possible. It was wood flexing and nails adjusting, pipes shifting, and wires stretching. The house's skeleton accommodating this unprecedented movement. The sound was almost alive, like the house was speaking for the first time, expressing surprise or perhaps relief at finally being free. With a slowness that was almost agonizing, the house began to move. Each inch forward was deliberate, calculated, the massive hydraulic systems working in perfect coordination to keep the structure level. It slid forward like a ship launching in reverse, clearing the shattered remains of its foundation with mere inches to spare. Chunks of concrete fell away from the base like scabs from a healing wound, clattering into the hole below. The wheels of the transporter, each one the size of a compact car, turned in perfect unison, their deep treads gripping the specially reinforced platform that Maverick's crew had laid down over the past 3 days. The engineering was beautiful in its precision, dozens of systems working together to achieve something that shouldn't be possible. The house, my house, was moving, carrying with it every memory embedded in its walls. I watched from Maverick's truck, my hands gripping the dashboard hard enough to leave indentations in the vinyl. My heart was a heavy drum against my ribs, each beat seeming to match the slow rotation of those massive wheels. The impossible was happening before my eyes, and even though I had planned it, paid for it, demanded it, part of me couldn't quite believe it was real. The house crept out of the driveway. I had sealed myself 15 years ago, the asphalt cracking slightly under the tremendous weight despite the load distribution system. It moved onto the street, where my children had learned to ride bicycles, where Mary had planted flowers along the curb, where we had hosted block parties on summer evenings that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The house was a monstrous, unbelievable beast, too large for the suburban street, too strange for a Thursday morning, too impossible for the ordinary world. A police escort, arranged by Maverick, who had cited the transport of an oversized prefabricated structure on the permits, moved ahead to clear the way. The officers seemed bemused by their assignment, one of them shaking his head repeatedly, as if trying to wake himself from a dream. Their lights flashed blue and red, creating a surreal carnival atmosphere, announcing to everyone that something extraordinary was happening. Neighbors began emerging from their houses like prairie dogs from burrows, drawn by the rumble of engines and the impossible sight. They stood on their lawns in various states of morning dress, some still in robes and slippers, others dressed for work but frozen in place, their coffee mugs suspended halfway to their lips. Their mouths hung open in disbelief, their cell phones raised to record the spectacle, the blue light of screens reflecting off their stunned faces. "Is that?" I heard one woman say to her husband, her voice carrying through Maverick's open window. "It can't be," he replied, but his eyes said otherwise. Children who should have been getting ready for school pressed their faces against windows, their excitement pure and uncomplicated by adult understanding of property laws and impossibilities. To them, this was magic, a house that could fly, or at least drive. One little boy ran alongside for a few yards, waving at the house as if it might wave back. We followed at a respectful distance of 50 feet, close enough to see every detail but far enough to avoid any debris that might fall. The house moved at a walking pace, perhaps 3 miles per hour. A slow, solemn procession that transformed the ordinary morning into something mythic. Behind us, a parade of cars began to form. Neighbors and strangers alike following this impossible funeral procession for a marriage, a family, a life that had been. As we turned onto the main boulevard, the public reaction grew exponentially. The 2-lane road that normally carried commuters to work and school became a viewing gallery. People stopped their cars in the middle of traffic, hazard lights blinking as drivers got out to stare. A city bus pulled to the curb, its passengers pressing against the windows, their morning commute forgotten in the face of this impossibility. Pedestrians froze on sidewalks, their dogs barking at the house as if it were a massive animal invading their territory. A jogger stopped mid-stride, pulling out his earbuds as if the music might be causing him to hallucinate. A woman dropped her grocery bags, oranges rolling across the pavement, but she didn't notice, transfixed by the sight of a 2-story colonial home rolling past the coffee shop where she bought her morning latte. This was no longer a private act of retribution. It had become a public spectacle, a performance piece about property and power, about what happens when you push someone too far. My private anger was being paraded through the center of town for all to see, transformed into something larger than my personal grievance. It had become a statement, a monument to the idea that sometimes the impossible is the only appropriate response to the unbearable. I thought about the sheer arrogance of Brielle and Kyler as we passed the restaurant where they had first suggested the nursing home. They had sought to humiliate me in the hushed atmosphere of that fancy establishment, speaking in careful euphemisms about care and safety when they meant imprisonment and theft. They had smiled while discussing my removal from my own life, as casual as if they were planning a vacation. I was answering their whispered conspiracy by moving the very ground beneath their feet, not in a whisper, but with the low, undeniable roar of diesel engines that could be heard 3 blocks away. The public reckoning they never anticipated was happening without them even being in the country. They were sipping wine in Rome, while their inheritance was literally driving away, leaving them with nothing but debt and embarrassment. They would come home not to a quiet victory, but to the lingering gossip of an entire community that had witnessed this impossible exodus. Every person recording on their phone would share the story, embellish it, make it legend. The couple who tried to steal a house and ended up with an empty hole would become a cautionary tale told at dinner parties and coffee shops for years to come. The journey was 5 miles long, though it felt like a lifetime. We passed the park where I had pushed Brielle on the swings when she was 4 years old, her laughter bright as silver bells, back when she still called me Daddy with genuine affection. The swings were still there, chains rusty now, seats cracked, moving slightly in the morning breeze, as if ghost children were playing. We rolled past the library where Mary had volunteered every Tuesday for 20 years, reading to children in her soft voice that could make any story magical. The banner outside advertised a book sale, and I wondered if any of her donated books were still on those shelves, waiting for someone else to love them. The building looked smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply grown smaller myself, diminished by loss. The high school where Brielle had graduated appeared on our left, its parking lot beginning to fill with cars as students arrived for first period. Some of them ran to the fence to watch the house pass, taking selfies with it in the background, already posting to social media with captions I could imagine. WTF rolling house. And only in our town. They had no idea they were watching someone's entire life being relocated, that inside those walls were rooms where a family had collapsed in slow motion. Each landmark was a station of the cross in my memory, a point of pain and remembrance that I was leaving behind. The grocery store where Mary had fainted during her first round of chemotherapy, the pharmacy where I had filled her prescriptions with hands that shook, the funeral home where we had said goodbye to her in a room that smelled of lilies and formaldehyde. All of it was being left behind, and the house was carrying me away from those ghosts. After what felt like a lifetime, but was actually 2 hours and 37 minutes according to Maverick's dashboard clock, we made the final turn. The road changed from asphalt to gravel, the sound under the transporter's wheels shifting from a smooth hum to a grinding crunch. We were heading toward the lake, following a road that most people didn't know existed. A path through tall pines that had been widened over the past week to accommodate our unusual cargo. The plot of land I had bought a decade ago had been Mary's dream. Someday, she had said, looking out over the water, we should build a little cabin here, just for weekends, somewhere quiet. I had bought it the next day, but we never built that cabin. The cancer came first, and then the dream seemed to die with her. But dreams, I had learned, could be patient. They could wait for the right moment to resurrect themselves. Maverick had spent the last week overseeing the pouring of a new, reinforced foundation that could handle the weight of a house never meant to move. The concrete was still fresh enough that you could smell it, that particular mixture of lime and dust that spoke of new beginnings. Steel rebar created a skeleton within the concrete, strong enough to hold my past and whatever future I had left. The transporter maneuvered the house over the new foundation with millimeter precision, guided by laser levels and GPS systems that could detect variations smaller than a human hair. The lead engineer called out measurements through her radio, her voice calm and professional, even as she guided something impossible into place. Workers scrambled around the edges, adjusting support beams and checking levels, their movements coordinated like a dance they had rehearsed 1,000 times. The final stage was the lowering, and this was the most dangerous part. If something went wrong now, if a hydraulic system failed or a support beam cracked, the house could collapse, taking with it everything I was trying to save. I held my breath as the platform began its descent, each inch taking several minutes as the engineer constantly checked and rechecked the alignment. This was not an act of extraction. It was an act of placement, of choosing where to plant new roots even if those roots were 40 years old. It was a homecoming to a place the house had never been, a paradox that seemed fitting for this entire, impossible day. The house settled onto its new base with a soft, solid thud that I felt in my chest. The sound of arrival, of completion, of something ending and beginning simultaneously. By sunset, the crew was gone, their equipment loaded onto trucks and driven away, leaving only tire tracks in the grass and the lingering smell of diesel exhaust. The house stood in the fading light, surrounded by towering pines that had been growing here since before I was born. The lake stretched out behind it, its surface turned gold and orange by the setting sun. Small waves lapping at the shore with a sound like whispered secrets. Here, nestled among the tall pines that filled the air with the scent of resin and earth, with the sun glinting off the lake like scattered coins, the house looked peaceful. It looked safe, protected by nature itself from the kind of people who would steal it. The windows that had once looked out on suburban sameness now reflected wilderness, and somehow that seemed right, as if the house had always been meant to be here. Maverick came and stood beside me at the edge of the water, our shadows long and thin across the sandy shore. He had been quiet throughout the day, letting me process this impossible thing we had done. Now, as night began to fall, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, he finally spoke. "She's home," he said, and I knew he meant both the house and Mary's memory within it. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat that made words impossible. After a moment, I managed to whisper, "She's home." We spent the next few days connecting the utilities, running new lines for electricity and water, and installing a septic system that would work with the sandy soil. It was strange and wonderful work, bringing the house back to life system by system. Each connection was like restoring circulation to a limb that had gone numb, returning function to something that had been paralyzed. When I flicked the first switch and saw a familiar lamp cast its warm glow in what was now the living room, I nearly cried. The light was the same, that soft yellow circle on the ceiling, but everything it illuminated was different. Instead of white walls and suburban furniture, I saw log walls and windows full of trees. The cognitive dissonance was profound, like waking up in a parallel universe where everything was familiar but shifted. The views from the windows were entirely new and endlessly fascinating. Instead of my neighbor's meticulously maintained petunias that she had watered every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, I saw a family of deer that came to drink from the lake each dawn. Their movements were careful and graceful, their large eyes always watching, even as they dipped their heads to the water. Instead of the constant sound of traffic that had been the white noise of my old life, I heard an eagle calling from somewhere high above, its cry wild and free. The quiet here was profound and healing, not the empty silence of loss, but the full quiet of nature, layered with small sounds. Wind in pine needles, water against shore, small animals moving through underbrush. It was the kind of quiet that didn't ask to be filled, that was complete in itself. On the third day, I drove back to the old street in Maverick's truck, needing to see what I had left behind. The sight of the empty lot was still a shock, even though I had created it. It was a raw, gaping wound in the neighborhood's perfect smile, a missing tooth in a row of white houses. All that remained was the foundation hole, already beginning to collect rainwater and dead leaves, and that absurd set of concrete steps that led to nowhere. The neighbors watched from their windows as I walked up those steps one last time, the familiar feel of them under my feet now a ghostly sensation, like touching something in a dream. 3 steps up to nothing, to air, to absence. I stood at the top, where my front door had been, and looked out at the street where I had spent 40 years of my life. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a single white envelope, the same quality paper I had used for all my important documents. Inside was a short, simple letter I had typed on Mary's old typewriter, the one she had used for her correspondence. The keys had stuck a little, giving the letters a slightly uneven quality that seemed appropriate. The letter stated the cold, hard facts of what they had done: the coercion, the threats, the planned imprisonment, and what I had done in return: the complete legal relocation of my property to land I owned free and clear, beyond their reach forever. I had included a photo of the house in its new location, looking peaceful among the pines, just to twist the knife a little deeper. I placed the envelope on the top step, weighing it down with a smooth stone from Mary's old rock garden, one of the few things I had left behind. It was a piece of rose quartz she had found on our honeymoon, pink and clouded, warm in my hand from the afternoon sun. It was a message in a bottle left on the shore of a ruined land, waiting for someone who thought they were coming home to paradise. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound was jarring in the quiet afternoon. A reminder that the modern world still existed even after what I had done. It was another message from Brielle, a picture of them at the Colosseum in Rome, both of them smiling with the confident joy of people who believed they had won. "Last leg of the trip," the message read, followed by a string of emoji I didn't understand. "Home tomorrow. Hope you're all packed and ready for your new adventure at Sunshine Acres. They said you can bring 2 suitcases." I looked at the picture, their tanned faces and expensive sunglasses, then at the empty lot with its ridiculous steps, then at the small white envelope that would destroy their world. A cold, grim smile touched my lips, the first real smile I had felt in months. "Oh, you have no idea," I whispered to the empty air that had once held my front door. "The real adventure is just about to begin." I walked back to the truck, leaving the envelope on the steps like a landmine waiting to be triggered. Tomorrow, they would come home to find their inheritance was a hole in the ground and a set of steps to nowhere. And I would be sitting on my porch by the lake, in a house they would never find, finally free from the burden of family that had become a chain around my neck. The sun was setting as I drove away, painting the empty lot in shades of red that looked like a wound. But wounds, I had learned, could heal. Sometimes you just had to cut away the infected tissue first, no matter how much it hurt. And sometimes the best revenge wasn't served cold. Sometimes it was served as an empty foundation and a white envelope, waiting in the space where a house used to be. They returned on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, when the autumn sun was already beginning its early descent toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and rust. I knew the precise time because Maverick had called me at 3:47, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone delivering news they knew would change everything. "The conquering heroes are on their way," he'd said, his voice dry as dust blown across empty fields. "Their flight landed an hour ago. They should be at the property by 5. I did not need to be there to witness their arrival. I had set the stage with meticulous care, each element arranged like pieces on a chessboard where the game was already over, but the losing player didn't know it yet. I could picture it all with a painful clarity that came from knowing these people better than they knew themselves, from years of watching their greed calcify into entitlement. The luxury taxi would be one of those black SUVs with tinted windows and leather seats that cost more per mile than most people made in an hour. They would have ordered it from the airport, Kyler making a show of selecting the premium option on the app, while Brielle watched approvingly. The vehicle would be loaded with their fortress of new luggage, matching sets in that particular shade of champagne gold that screamed money without quite achieving class. Each piece would have been carefully selected from the designer boutiques in Cabo San Lucas, paid for with credit cards they had already mentally paid off with my money. The air inside the vehicle would be thick with their self-satisfaction, perfumed with Brielle's new fragrance, something French and overwhelming that she had bought at duty-free. They would sit in the back seat like royalty returning to claim their kingdom, scrolling through photos on their phones, already planning their social media posts about their new life of leisure. The leather would creak softly as they shifted, adjusting their new designer sunglasses, checking their tans in the reflection of their phone screens. They would talk about the new condo they had already put an offer on, a glass and steel monument to modern living with a view of the city skyline. Kyler would describe the sports car he had configured online, a German machine in metallic blue with every possible upgrade, his voice thick with anticipation. They would laugh about how easy it had all been, how smoothly the sale had gone through while they sipped cocktails on the beach. "He didn't even put up a fight," Kyler would say, shaking his head with mock sympathy. "Just signed where we told him to sign. It was almost sad, really." Brielle would have smiled at that, her newly whitened teeth catching the afternoon light. He was just tired, honey. Old and tired. It was for the best, really. We did him a favor. That house was too much for him anyway. As the taxi turned onto their old street, the familiar maple trees now mostly bare, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers, a sense of triumphant homecoming would settle over them. They were returning as different people, transformed by wealth that hadn't even hit their accounts yet. In their minds, they were already the successful couple they had always believed they deserved to be, freed from the burden of caring for an elderly parent who had outlived his usefulness. The driver would slow as they approached the property, probably confused by the GPS directing him to what looked like an empty lot. "This is the place?" he would ask, checking his phone against the house numbers on the neighboring properties. Yes, this is it," Kyler would insist, already reaching for his wallet, pulling out bills with the casual confidence of someone who no longer needed to count them. He would pay the driver with a $100 bill for a $60 fare, telling him to keep the change with the magnanimous air of new money. "Buy yourself something nice," he might say, the condescension dripping from his words like honey from a spoon. They would step out onto the sidewalk, their expensive shoes clicking on the concrete, smiling with the satisfaction of prodigal children returning home. The afternoon sun would be warm on their faces, the air crisp with the promise of winter. They would not notice the unusual quiet on the street, the way no cars passed, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. They would not see my neighbor peering through her curtains, her face a mixture of anticipation and disbelief, having watched the demolition crews work with methodical efficiency while they were gone. They would walk up the driveway, or what used to be the driveway, now just a stretch of fresh gravel that crunched under their feet with a sound like breaking bones. Kyler would be jingling the single house key on his designer keychain, the metal making a cheerful sound that would soon turn mocking. Brielle would be looking at the garden, or what remained of it, her nose wrinkling with disapproval. "The roses are a complete mess," she would murmur, not yet registering that the roses weren't just neglected, but entirely gone, the beds filled with fresh topsoil. "It's a good thing we stepped in when we did. Can you imagine if he'd tried to maintain this place another year?" They would be so focused on their internal narrative of rescue and profit that the obvious signs would slip past them at first. The missing mailbox, the absent porch light, the way the front walk seemed to end abruptly at a set of concrete steps that rose from the ground like a monument to something that no longer existed. They would reach those front steps, still laughing about something from their trip. Maybe the waiter who had flirted with Brielle, or the couple from Milwaukee they had met at the pool bar. Their voices would carry in the still air, too loud for the suburban afternoon, announcing their presence to everyone within earshot. And then, Kyler would climb those 3 concrete steps with the confidence of a man approaching his own front door, the key already extended toward where the lock should be. His hand would meet empty air. The first moment of confusion would be almost comic, his arm extended into nothing, his body leaning forward slightly as if the door might materialize if he just reached a little further. He would frown, that particular expression of irritation that came when reality didn't align with his expectations. He would look down at the key, as if it might be the wrong one, though he knew perfectly well it wasn't. "What the hell?" he would mutter, his voice carrying the first note of uncertainty. He would try again, this time actually looking at where his hand was going, and that's when the first crack in his understanding would appear. There was no door. There was no doorframe. There was no wall for a doorframe to be set into. There was just air, open air, where solid wood and brass fixtures should have been. "Kyler?" Brielle would say from behind him, her voice tight with impatience. "What's taking so long? Just open the door. I need to use a real bathroom, not those awful airplane ones." He would turn to her slowly, his face beginning to drain of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. "Brielle," he would say, his voice strange and hollow. "The door. It's... Oh, for God's sake! She would snap, pushing past him with the irritation of someone who had spent 8 hours in airports and airplane seats. Honestly, Kyler, it's just a door. How hard can it be? Her words would die in her throat. She would stand at the top of those concrete steps, her designer handbag sliding from her shoulder to hang limply from her elbow, staring at the nothing where their inherited fortune should have been. The silence would stretch between them, broken only by the distant sound of a dog barking and the whisper of wind through bare branches. It was then, in that moment of paralyzing confusion, that one of them would finally think to look up. Maybe it would be Kyler. His analytical mind trying to make sense of the impossible, or Brielle, her eyes searching for some explanation that wouldn't destroy everything they had planned. Their gaze would travel upward, expecting to see the familiar white siding of the second story, the windows of the bedrooms where they had already planned to install new curtains. They would see only blue sky, a vast, empty, impossible expanse of blue sky stretched where the second story was supposed to be, wisps of clouds drifting lazily past where the master bedroom should have stood. The afternoon sun shone down unobstructed into what should have been the interior of a house, illuminating nothing but air and absence. The confusion would transform into something closer to vertigo, that dizzy, sick feeling when the world tilts and nothing is where it should be. They would look at each other, their faces blank with incomprehension, their tanned skin suddenly looking gray in the afternoon light. And then, together, as if controlled by the same horrified impulse, their eyes would travel downward slowly, fearfully, taking in the full scope of what had happened. They were standing on the set of concrete steps that led to nothing. The steps rose from a foundation that enclosed only earth and emptiness. The porch was gone, the door was gone, the windows were gone, the walls were gone. The entire house had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. All that remained was a raw, rectangular hole in the ground, perhaps 8 feet deep, lined with concrete blocks that had once supported a home. The foundation looked like an archaeological site, or a grave waiting for a giant's coffin. Weeds had already begun to sprout in the corners where seeds had blown in over the past 2 weeks. A few pieces of broken glass glinted in the dirt at the bottom, catching the light like scattered diamonds, the only evidence that something had once stood here. The silence that would fall between them would be absolute, the kind of silence that comes after an explosion when your ears are ringing and the world seems muted. They would stand frozen on those steps, 2 well-dressed statues on a ruined pedestal, their minds refusing to process what their eyes were screaming at them. The impossibility of it would create a kind of mental static, a white noise of denial that prevented any coherent thought from forming. Kyler would be the first to break from the paralysis, his body moving with the jerky mechanical motion of someone sleepwalking. He would walk stiffly down the steps and begin to circle the foundation, his expensive loafers slipping slightly on the gravel. He would peer into the hole as if the house might be hiding down there, collapsed but intact, waiting to be raised again. His hands would grip the edge of the foundation wall, the concrete rough and cold under his palms, leaving gray dust on his skin. He would make a complete circuit of the foundation, his movements becoming increasingly frantic, his breathing getting louder and more ragged. At one corner, he would actually climb down into the foundation, his designer clothes getting dirty as he scrambled over the broken ground, kicking at the dirt as if he might uncover some clue, some explanation that would make this make sense. Brielle would remain on the steps, frozen in place like Lot's wife turned to salt. Her expensive handbag would finally slip completely from her arm, falling to the concrete with a soft thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. She would start to tremble, first just her hands, then her arms, then her whole body shaking as if the temperature had suddenly dropped to freezing. People were watching now. The silent audience to their private apocalypse was growing as neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the spectacle of the couple standing at the ruins of what had been a home. They gathered in small groups on the sidewalk, their voices a low murmur of speculation and barely suppressed satisfaction. Everyone had known what Kyler and Brielle had done, how they had forced the old man out, and now they were witnessing the consequences. "Is that them?" someone would whisper. "Look at their faces," another would reply. They had no idea. "Serves them right," a third voice would add, not bothering to lower their volume. The comments would drift across the air to where Brielle stood shaking on the steps, each word a small stone thrown at her crumbling composure. Her eyes would dart from face to face, seeing not sympathy but judgment, not concern but satisfaction. These people, her future neighbors in her mind, were enjoying this. They were witnessing her humiliation, and they were glad. It would be Brielle who saw it first, through eyes blurred with tears she didn't remember starting to cry. The small white envelope tucked precisely where the front door should have been, held in place by a single nail driven into the wooden step. It looked clean and calm and deliberate against the weathered concrete, like a formal invitation to a funeral. She would move toward it slowly, her legs unsteady as if she were walking on a ship's deck in rough seas. Her hand would shake so badly she could barely grasp the envelope, her manicured nails scratching against the paper. The envelope would be quality stock, heavyweight paper that spoke of importance and finality. Her name and Kyler's would be written on the front in careful, precise handwriting she recognized as her father-in-law's. She would tear it open with clumsy fingers, the paper ripping jaggedly, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the letter inside. The page would be folded twice, crisp lines that spoke of deliberation and care. Kyler would have returned by then, dirt on his clothes and his face pale as winter moonlight, his eyes wild with the look of someone whose world had fundamentally broken. "What is it?" he would demand, his voice cracking like a teenage boy's. "What the hell is going on? Where's the house? Where's my inheritance?" She wouldn't answer immediately, just stare at the letter, her eyes moving across the lines but not seeming to comprehend them. Her lips would move silently, forming words that wouldn't come out, as if speaking them would make them real. Finally, in a voice cracked with dawning, unspeakable horror, she would begin to read it aloud. "Brielle and Kyler," she would read, her voice trembling like leaves in a storm. "I hope you had a pleasant trip to Cabo San Lucas. The weather there is lovely this time of year, or so I'm told. You successfully sold the land for $1 million. Congratulations on your negotiation skills." Her voice would falter on the word congratulations, the sarcasm in it sharp enough to cut. She would look at Kyler, her eyes begging him to make it make sense, to explain how this could be happening. His face would be blank, uncomprehending, still processing the impossibility of a house that had simply vanished. She would force her eyes back to the page, though each word would feel like swallowing broken glass. "But you seem to have forgotten something in your haste to cash in on what you assumed was yours. You could sell my land because the power of attorney you coerced me to sign gave you that authority. But you could not sell my home. This house, built by my own hands over 40 years ago and filled with my own memories, was and is mine, and I have moved it." The words would hang in the air, utterly insane, yet undeniably true. The proof was all around them in the form of absence, in the nothing where something should have been. Brielle's breathing would become ragged, hyperventilating as her designer sunglasses slipped from her head to clatter on the concrete. "How?" Kyler would whisper. "How is this possible?" Brielle would continue reading, her voice now barely above a whisper. "As for the $1 million you were so eager to collect, my lawyer has already been in contact with the buyer and the bank. providing them with extensive proof of the fraud and coercion used to obtain my signature on the power of attorney. The security footage from the house, which you didn't know existed, clearly shows you threatening me. The transaction has been frozen pending investigation. You will not be receiving a single cent. That would be the moment it all shattered completely. The dream of wealth, the vision of success, the future. They had spent borrowed money to celebrate. All of it, gone like the house itself, leaving only debt and emptiness. The credit cards maxed out in Cabo, the deposits placed on the condo and car, the obligations they had taken on in anticipation of a windfall that would never come. Brielle's eyes would find the final lines of the letter, written in slightly larger script, as if to ensure they couldn't be missed. You wanted me in a nursing home, locked away where I couldn't interfere with your plans. Instead, I have given my home a new home, somewhere it will be appreciated. Do not try to find me. Do not try to contact me. You are no longer my son, and she was never my daughter. Consider this my final gift to you. The opportunity to build your own life, without stealing someone else's. The letter would slip from her numb fingers, floating down like an autumn leaf to land in the dirt at the bottom of the foundation. She would look at Kyler, her face transforming from shock to fury, the kind of rage that comes when entitlement meets reality and loses. Her carefully applied makeup would be running now, black streams of mascara creating tracks down her cheeks like war paint. And then she would open her mouth and scream. It would not be a sound of fear or sadness or even simple anger. It would be a raw, primal scream of pure, thwarted greed, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than thought, from the animal part of her that had been denied its prey. It would be the sound of someone who had touched gold only to have it turn to dust in their hands, who had tasted victory only to have it turn to ash in their mouth. The scream would echo off the empty foundation, amplified by the concrete walls into something inhuman. The birds in the old oak tree at the property line would burst into the sky in a panic of wings, their cries mixing with hers to create a symphony of distress. Dogs throughout the neighborhood would begin to bark, adding their voices to the chaos. Kyler would stand beside her, his own face slack with shock, before his own voice joined hers. His scream would be different, lower, more guttural, the sound of a man watching everything he thought he owned disappear like smoke. Together, their voices would create a harmony of horrified despair that would become neighborhood legend. The day the couple screamed at an empty foundation. Their screams would continue until their throats were raw, until they had no voice left, until they stood gasping and speechless in the ruins of their greed. The sun would continue its descent, painting the empty foundation in shades of red that looked like blood, a fitting backdrop to the beautiful, complete destruction of their plans. The neighbors would continue to watch, some recording on their phones, others simply bearing witness to this moment of perfect justice. They would tell this story for years, adding details, embellishing the screams, describing the looks on the couple's faces. It would become a cautionary tale, a modern fable about what happens when children value inheritance over family, when greed becomes stronger than love. And somewhere, far away, in a small town they would never find, an old man would be sitting on the porch of his relocated home, watching the sun set over unfamiliar mountains, finally at peace. I never heard their screams, but I didn't need to. I could imagine them, a sound that would curdle the air. In the days that followed, I existed in a state of profound and surreal peace. My new home, my old home, stood silent and steadfast among the pines, the scent of the lake a clean and constant presence. I spent my mornings on the porch, a mug of coffee warming my hands, watching the sun rise over the water. The light here was different, softer. It was pure. I found myself breathing more deeply than I had in years. Maverick called me once, about a week after their return. His voice was flat, a simple report. "They're gone," he said. There was no triumph in his tone, only finality. "Word is the bank called in all their loans. The down payment on the condo is gone. They sold her car, sold his watch, packed what they could fit into their old sedan, and left in the middle of the night. No one knows where they went." I listened without speaking, watching a lone hawk circle high above the lake. "You did the right thing," Maverick added. I thanked him, and we hung up. I did not feel a rush of victory. I did not feel joy. I felt a great, hollowing sadness, the kind you feel when a surgeon removes something that was killing you, but was still a part of you. The limb was amputated. The patient would live. I thought of Brielle, the little girl with scraped knees I used to carry on my shoulders. I searched for that person in the woman who had stood on my porch and screamed in pure, thwarted greed, and I could not find her. She was a ghost, a memory from a life that no longer existed. They had tried to turn my home into a house, a thing to be bought and sold. They had failed to understand that a home is not made of wood and nails. It is made of respect, of love, of memory. It is a living thing. And when you try to kill it, sometimes it finds a way to move. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, golden fingers of light across the water, I walked down to the small, rocky shore. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old house key, the one Kyler had tossed so carelessly onto my kitchen counter. It felt cold and foreign in my hand, a relic from a buried civilization. It was a key to a door that no longer existed, a lock that had been left behind in a pile of rubble. It was a symbol of their arrogance. I held it for a long moment, then drew my arm back and threw it as far as I could. It spun through the air, a tiny, dark shape against the vibrant orange of the sunset, before landing in the deep, quiet water with a small, almost perceptible splash. The ripples spread out, shimmering, and then they were gone. The surface of the lake was smooth again, as if the key and the life it represented had never been there at all. I turned and walked back to my house, the house that had traveled with me, the house that was truly my home. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt free. They lost everything because they underestimated their father. What would you have done in his shoes? Please share your thoughts in the comments and tell us if you think this was the perfect revenge.